So, here's something remarkable. A future king arrives at a private family summit that took months to organize. A carefully planned gathering at Windsor. Every senior figure is there, and the entire meeting has been arranged to settle an issue the family has been circling around for nearly a year. And then he cancels it. Not after a disagreement. Not halfway through the discussion. Before anyone has even taken a seat. And according to every account, it happened because of one face in the room. Someone who was never supposed to be there. Someone whose presence instantly told William that this was not the meeting he had been promised. It was Camilla's personal lawyer. And the second William recognized her, he turned around and shut the entire summit down. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel, because the reason a single lawyer could bring a royal summit to a halt reveals more about how this family truly operates than most people realize. I'm Harold, and on this channel I take the headlines everyone sees and look beneath them. Who was really in the room? What was actually being discussed? And what crucial detail did almost everyone miss? By the end of this story, you'll understand why William believed the safest move wasn't to continue the meeting. It was to make sure the meeting never happened at all. Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is refusing to give the other side the room they need. But first, let's understand what this Windsor Summit was really supposed to be. Because the word summit carries far more weight than most people think. In this family, a summit is never just a conversation. It's a rare, carefully planned gathering that only happens when something important needs to be settled and ordinary channels are no longer enough. There's a real example of this. Back in January 2020, when Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from royal duties, the family held what became known as the Sandringham Summit. Charles, William, Harry, and Queen Elizabeth all sat down together to determine what came next. That meeting was real, widely reported, and it created a blueprint. When the stakes are high enough, everyone is brought into one room and the issue is handled face to face. So when word began circulating that another Windsor Summit was being arranged, people familiar with royal affairs immediately understood the signal. Something significant was being decided. And this time, the focus was the future. Specifically, what would happen to the structure of the family and certain long-term arrangements once Charles's reign eventually came to an end. To understand why the summit felt so urgent, you have to remember the backdrop. Charles was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024. That announcement came directly from the palace. Although he continued carrying out many of his duties, the diagnosis changed the atmosphere inside the family. Questions that once seemed distant suddenly felt immediate. Questions about authority. Questions about responsibilities. Questions about where certain people would stand when the crown eventually passed to the next generation. Those issues were no longer theoretical. They suddenly came with a clock attached to them. And nothing puts pressure on a family quite like a clock that cannot be stopped. That pressure is what gave birth to the Windsor Summit. Not a public scandal. Not a headline crisis. Something much quieter. A growing belief that the opportunity to settle certain matters was beginning to disappear. Even the location carried meaning. Windsor was not chosen by accident. Buckingham Palace represents the institution. Clarence House represents Charles. But Windsor has always represented the family itself. It is the place connected to generations of private history. A setting that feels less like government and more like blood ties. Choosing Windsor sent a message. This is family, not politics. Come as relatives, not rivals. And as you'll soon see, that message mattered more than anyone realized. Because the more a room is designed to feel like family, the easier it becomes to lower your guard. And as William would soon realize, that was exactly the point. The summit was arranged. Months of preparation. A date at Windsor. A carefully selected guest list. And this is where the story really begins. Because almost nobody pays attention to guest lists. The gathering was presented as a simple family discussion. Senior royals, a few trusted advisors, and the kind of setting where important matters could be discussed privately before anything was ever put into writing. That description mattered. Because it shaped how everyone was expected to behave the moment they entered the room. A family discussion is relaxed. Informal. Off the record. People speak more freely. They say things they might never commit to paper because they're surrounded by relatives rather than negotiators. That was the atmosphere this summit was supposed to create. Warm. Comfortable. Trusting. And there's one detail that becomes incredibly important later. According to reports, William had already been given a version of the guest list before the meeting, as is normal for an event of this importance. But one name wasn't on it: Camilla's lawyer. Either she was added quietly at the last minute, or her presence was never disclosed at all. Which means one thing: the entire plan depended on William not knowing she would be there until he had already entered the room. Think about what that suggests. If her presence was completely innocent, there would have been no reason to hide it. People don't conceal ordinary details. They conceal details that only work if someone discovers them too late. The fact that her name was absent from the guest list tells its own story. Someone understood that if William knew a private lawyer would be attending, he might never agree to enter the room in the first place. So the only way for the meeting to happen was to make sure he didn't know. The problem was that William noticed before it was too late. He walked into the room and immediately spotted someone standing near the window. Someone who clearly didn't belong in what had been described as a simple family discussion. It was Camilla's personal solicitor. Not a palace legal advisor representing the institution. Not someone working for the crown. Her own private lawyer. And the second William recognized who she was, everything changed. Because this is the moment where the entire story turns. There is a huge difference between a family discussion and a legal negotiation. And the thing that separates the two is often a lawyer. The moment a private solicitor is standing in the room, the atmosphere changes completely. What was supposed to be an informal conversation suddenly becomes something far more serious. Every comment can be remembered. Every statement can be referenced later. Every apparent agreement can be interpreted as consent. A casual family exchange stops being casual. William saw that instantly. One look at the woman standing by the window told him that he had walked into a room presented as one thing but intended to become something else entirely. And what makes this so remarkable is how quickly he understood it. Most people would have seen an unfamiliar face and assumed nothing was wrong. An assistant, a staff member, an advisor, something harmless. But William recognized her immediately. Camilla's personal solicitor. Not a representative of the palace. Not someone serving the institution. Someone there to protect Camilla's private interests. And within seconds, his mind connected all the pieces. A private lawyer. A family summit. A guest list that never mentioned her name. A position quietly off to the side of the room. Each detail alone could be explained away. Together, they pointed toward something very different. Negotiation. William didn't need to hear the agenda. He didn't need anyone to explain why she was there. Her presence was the agenda. The entire purpose of the meeting suddenly became clear before anyone had spoken a single word. He read the room in seconds. And that tells you something important. It tells you that trust had already disappeared long before that day. Because for William to assume the worst so quickly, he had to believe there was a real possibility he was being maneuvered. He didn't pause to search for an innocent explanation. He didn't ask questions first. His immediate conclusion was that he had been brought into a carefully arranged situation without being told the whole truth. And whether that conclusion was right or wrong almost becomes secondary. What matters is what it reveals about the relationship itself. A relationship where one side now expects hidden motives. A relationship where every room has to be examined for what isn't being said. A relationship where a future king walks into a family gathering and instinctively scans it like a chessboard. Whatever else you think about William, that's not a comfortable way to live. William looked at the woman by the window and understood immediately that the room had been presented as one thing while serving an entirely different purpose. And that answers the question many people ask. Why cancel the summit? Why not simply sit down and see where the discussion went? Because William recognized something most people would have missed. The problem wasn't what might be said. The problem was the room itself. The moment he sat down and participated, the situation changed. Any sign of agreement, any attempt to keep the peace, any willingness to continue the conversation could later be interpreted as acceptance. And once that happened, the entire dynamic shifted. The safest way to avoid a trap built around participation is simple. Don't participate. So that's exactly what William did. He didn't argue. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't create a scene in front of everyone present. He simply announced that the meeting would not be moving forward and walked away. In that single moment, he removed the one thing the entire gathering depended on. His presence. Without William in the chair, the summit had no purpose. And before we go further into what the lawyer may have actually been there to accomplish, there's an important connection worth making. Because stories like this are rarely about arguments. They're usually about paperwork, documents, agreements, understandings quietly reached behind closed doors. Time and again, the biggest royal disputes are not settled through public confrontations. They're settled through legal arrangements most people never see. And William understood that better than most. A person who has watched how powerful a single document can become does not casually walk into a room where a private lawyer is waiting. He knew how these situations worked. And he had no intention of being caught off guard. So what was the summit really about? What outcome was everyone hoping to secure? This is where the picture becomes more complicated. Because no official documents have ever been released. No public record exists explaining exactly what was on the table that day. The palace has never provided a detailed explanation. But based on the people involved and the purpose of the gathering, many observers believe the summit revolved around one central idea: continuity. A simple word. A comfortable word. A word that sounds responsible and reasonable. But continuity only sounds simple until you ask one question. Continuity for whom? Because according to those accounts, continuity was the real objective behind the summit. And that word keeps appearing in stories like this because it sounds harmless, sensible, responsible. But continuity can mean very different things depending on who benefits from it. In this case, continuity reportedly meant protecting Camilla's future position, her standing, her arrangements, her role once Charles's reign eventually came to an end. The goal was to secure certain understandings while Charles was still king and able to support them with his authority. In other words, to establish arrangements that would continue into a future reign when William, not Charles, would hold the power. And that's why the summit mattered so much. A formal legal process would have required direct approval and clear documentation. Everyone understood that William would likely refuse such a request. But a family gathering created a different opportunity. A warm setting. An informal conversation. A room where agreement might appear naturally rather than through official paperwork. And if a lawyer happened to be present to witness those discussions, the appearance of consensus could become extremely valuable later. Not necessarily a signature, but something that could be described as support. Something that could be referenced in future discussions. Because when you look at the details, the strategy becomes easier to understand. Reports suggest the proposed arrangements involved several important issues. Questions surrounding residences. Questions surrounding status and responsibilities. Questions about Camilla's position, and perhaps most importantly, questions about how much influence she might continue to hold in a future reign. From William's perspective, those questions were enormous. A future monarch cannot easily inherit a system where major decisions have already been shaped behind closed doors, especially when those decisions affect his own reign before it has even begun. And timing mattered. Because if such arrangements were going to be established, they needed Charles's authority behind them. Once William became king, everything would be different. The opportunity would be gone. Which meant the pressure wasn't simply emotional. It was strategic. The clock wasn't just creating urgency. The clock was creating leverage. Secure the arrangements before power changes hands. Because after that moment, the answer might be no forever. And suddenly the entire atmosphere of the summit looks different. The Windsor setting. The family framing. The relaxed environment. The language of unity and understanding. Viewed one way, it looked like a family conversation. Viewed another way, it looked like a carefully designed environment intended to lower William's defenses. And that's exactly why the lawyer's presence mattered so much. Because once William saw her standing there, he no longer saw a family discussion. He saw a negotiation. And the second he saw that, the summit was already over. Because after that moment, the story didn't really end. In many ways, it was only beginning. By some accounts, Charles understood exactly what had happened. And that may have been the hardest part of all. Because if the arrangement had been completely straightforward, there would have been no reason to leave a lawyer off the guest list in the first place. The method itself created the problem. It suggested that even those behind the summit were unsure they would receive the answer they wanted if everything had been presented openly from the start. And that's what makes this situation feel less strategic and more deeply personal. Many observers don't see Charles as someone enjoying a clever maneuver. They see a husband trying to protect his wife, persuaded that urgency justified a method he normally wouldn't have chosen, and then being caught in that choice by his own son. Not through an argument, not through a confrontation, but through a single glance across a room. William never publicly accused anyone. He never pointed fingers. He simply refused to participate. And sometimes that kind of response carries more weight than any speech ever could. Because the issue was never the subject being discussed. The issue was the way the discussion had been arranged. From William's perspective, the problem wasn't the request. It was the ambush. And what happened afterward may have been even more important than the walkout itself. According to those close to the household, William quietly made something clear. Any future meeting presented as a family discussion would remain exactly that. If legal representatives were attending, everyone would know beforehand.
No surprises. No hidden editions.
No private solicitors appearing in the corner of a room after people had already arrived. In a single decision, he closed the loophole that had made the entire summit possible. He didn't just stop one meeting. He changed the rules for every meeting that might follow. And that's where Princess and reportedly enters the story. According to several accounts, and immediately understood why William reacted the way he did. Her view was simple. A lawyer appearing at a family summit is never an accident. And if William felt misled, he was right to leave. That matters because and has long been seen as one of the strongest defenders of royal procedure. She values process. She values rules. And she believes institutions survive only when people follow them consistently. From that perspective, the summit represented something troubling. A legal negotiation dressed up as a family conversation. An attempt to achieve privately what might not succeed openly. And for someone like Anne, that isn't clever. It's dangerous. Because once rules become flexible for one person, they become flexible for everyone. Which is why her support carried so much weight. It wasn't loyalty to William. It was loyalty to the principle that important matters should be handled properly. And in her eyes, this one wasn't. But there's another side to this story that's much harder to ignore. Because by refusing the room, William also, and buried underneath all the strategy, suspicion, and maneuvering was a genuine issue that still remains unresolved. Camilla's concerns were real. Charles's desire to protect his wife was real. And the question of what happens to a queen consort after a reign comes to an end is not an unreasonable one. Any family would eventually need to discuss it. The problem is that once trust disappears, even necessary conversations become difficult. And that may be the quiet cost of everything that happened at Windsor. Because now the subject itself has become linked to the method that was used. The moment William saw what he believed was an ambush, the entire discussion became contaminated by it. Even if an honest version of that conversation still needs to happen someday, reaching it may now be much harder than before. That's the hidden damage beneath all the drama. Two things can be true at the same time. William may have been completely right to refuse a situation he believed was designed to pressure him. And the issue everyone was trying to address may still be a real issue that deserves an answer. One problem was stopped. The other remains. What happens to Camilla after Charles is gone? That question remains just as unresolved today as it was before the summit was ever arranged. The meeting didn't solve it. It simply proved that the answer couldn't be forced. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from the entire story. Everyone believed the summit itself was the main event. But it wasn't. The real event lasted only a second. A future king walked into a room, noticed something nobody expected him to notice, and made a decision before a single discussion began. The most important thing that happened that day was something that never happened at all. A meeting that never took place. An agreement that never existed. A conversation that ended before it started. Because in royal life, power is rarely about who speaks the loudest. It's usually about who understands the situation first. And on that day, William understood exactly what he believed the room was for. Then he walked away before the door could close behind him. So what do you think? Was William right to shut the summit down the moment he saw the warning signs? Or did he close the door on a conversation that eventually needs to happen? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy these deeper royal stories, make sure you're subscribed, because with this family, the meeting is rarely the real story. The real story is usually the move nobody sees coming. And maybe that's why this story continues to resonate long after the summit itself disappeared. Because at its heart, this was never really about lawyers, guest lists, or even royal protocol. It was about trust. Or more accurately, the absence of it. A family that once relied on private understanding now finds itself examining every detail, every invitation, and every conversation for hidden meaning. And when trust reaches that point, even the simplest meeting can become impossible. William's decision changed more than a single afternoon at Windsor. It sent a message about how future discussions would be handled.
No surprises.
No undisclosed participants. No situations where the purpose of the room is different from what people were told beforehand. Whether people agree with that decision or not, the message was unmistakable. The next king intends to play by clear rules. And anyone hoping to influence the future will have to do so openly. Perhaps that's why the summit collapsed so quickly. The moment William saw something that didn't match the description he'd been given, the entire foundation of the meeting disappeared. Without trust, there was no discussion. Without discussion, there was no summit. And without the summit, there was no path to the outcome some people had hoped to achieve. In the end, the room was ready. The participants were ready. The plans had been prepared for months. Yet everything came down to a single second. One glance. One realization. One decision. And sometimes history changes not because of what people choose to do, but because of what they refuse to do. That may be the real legacy of the Windsor Summit that never happened. A reminder that the most powerful decision in the room can sometimes be the decision to walk away. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.